Hi, it's me. And also, it's party time for telephoto shooters who own lovely new Canon mirrorless cameras, as we're all now on the receiving end of Canon's first ever low-budget 100 to 400mm lens, the RF 100 to 400mm f5.6 to f8 IS USM. Well, I say it's low budget. $650 in the US or £700 in the UK is hardly chump change, but hey, it gets you to 400mm in a relatively affordable manner. And I love shooting at 400mm. I've often said that that's about the least telephoto reach you should be after if you're seriously into bird and wildlife photography, so I appreciate Canon going straight into releasing a lens of this zoom range instead of churning out yet another 70 to 300mm one instead. This lens's key disadvantage is made clear in its name, that maximum aperture of f5.6, which darkens to f8 as you zoom in, is much darker than usual for a telephoto zoom, so don't expect to get the most out of focus backgrounds in the world here, and also it won't make a good lens for sports photography unless you're able to shoot in bright sunlight or willing to use exceptionally high ISO levels. Still, the good news is that the high ISO image quality of Canon's cameras is pretty fantastic these days, and the lens has a good image stabilization system to help out as well, offering about 5 stops of assistance. So the lens can just about get away with that dark aperture, but you should still be aware of its resulting limitations. However, a real advantage of that dark aperture is how relatively small and lightweight this lens can then be. It's only a little larger than a traditional 70 to 300mm lens, and at 630 grams or 1.5 pounds, it's a very easy lens to carry around with you and take almost anywhere. It has an elongated appearance that's almost comical, looking a bit like a zoomable kit lens that Canon's designers simply decided to stretch out a bit. If I were being coarse, I'd make a comment about its rather phallic appearance, although it's certainly not a very sexy looking lens by any stretch of the imagination. It's made of plastic with a metal mount, although there's no weather sealing gasket there. Up from the rear come the controls for image stabilization and autofocus, followed by a broad and rubberized zoom ring. It turns evenly and reasonably smoothly, but with a little stickiness and weight to it that means it doesn't suffer from any zoom creeping. A lock switch is included though, to keep it at 100mm in case the zoom action begins to loosen up over time. Then comes a fairly wide plastic focus ring. The lens's focus motor responds very well to it being turned, and pleasingly, the lens doesn't really suffer from focus breathing. Talking about the lens's autofocus motor, well, despite being a lower budget lens, Canon have blessed this thing with their top-of-the-line Nano USM autofocus system. This means that, even taking into consideration the lens's rather dark maximum aperture, it focuses silently, accurately, and almost instantaneously. You will have no trouble tracking and shooting birds and other moving subjects with this lens. There's one of Canon's neat control rings at the top of the lens, which has gentle clicks to it. You can customize it on your camera to perform various different actions, or even send your lens away to Canon to have that control ring de-clicked for a price. The lens does not come with a hood, although one is available separately for a rather hefty $45. Its front filter size is 67mm wide. Overall, it might not be the prettiest lens to look at, but actually everything about its image quality kinda kicks ass for a lower budget option. Its electronics and its handling are both fantastic. But what about image quality? I'll be testing this lens on a Canon EOS R5 with its full-frame 45MP sensor with in-camera corrections turned on. At 100mm and f5.6, sharpness and contrast are very good in the middle of the image, but not quite perfect. The corners look noticeably softer but still fairly nice. Stop down to f8 and the corners see a minuscule improvement in sharpness and brightness, and picture quality in the middle now looks razor sharp. The lens stays this sharp at 100mm down to f11. Alright, let's zoom in halfway to 250mm. The maximum aperture here has already decreased to f7.1. Image quality looks excellent in the middle here. The corners are just a little sharper than at wider angles, looking good at f7.1, and at f11, again, they become just marginally sharper. Finally, let's zoom all the way into 400mm. At that dark maximum aperture of f8, the good news is that the lens remains very sharp in the middle of your images, although perhaps, again, not quite razor sharp. The corners, well, it's the same story. They do look a little softer, but are still pretty nice and sharp. Stopping down to f11 doesn't yield any improvement here. So, our conclusion here is plain and simple, although it's not as bitingly sharp as one of Canon's L lenses. For instance, the RF 100-500mm is noticeably better and more expensive. Well, this lower budget 100-400mm option is actually very good indeed, giving an even performance throughout the zoom range, with images that are always enjoying plenty of detail and good contrast. Nice. Okay, let's turn in-camera corrections off and look at distortion and vignetting. At 100mm, we see some noticeable pincushion distortion and darker corners at f5.6. Stop down to f8 or f11 though, and those corners quickly brighten up. Zoom into 400mm, and that distortion is still there, although not quite as pronounced. Again, at the maximum aperture, some vignetting is visible. Stop down to f11 to see even brightness across the image frame. Alright, let's take a look at close-up image quality now. Zoom into 400mm and the lens can focus as closely as 1 meter, treating you to some spectacular, almost macro photography images. Image quality at that close distance though is just okay at both f8 or f11. The likelihood here is that the close shooting distance means diffraction has become an issue, softening your image even when shooting at the brightest aperture. Well, let's see how this lens performs when faced against bright lights. Impressively, there's virtually no flaring to be seen here at all, even when you zoom all the way in. That's very reassuring. You don't really need to bother with that $45 lens hood then. Let's take a look at this lens's bokeh. Its dark maximum aperture means that other telephoto lens options will give you much better background separation, but still zoom in enough, and this lens can offer you some pretty soft backgrounds, although the brightest points and lines there will carry just a little heaviness to them. And finally, related to bokeh comes longitudinal chromatic aberration. At the lens's brightest apertures, a little purple and yellow highlighting can be seen around the plane of focus. Stop down a little and it goes away quite quickly. Overall, well, the biggest question mark that any serious photographer will have when it comes to this lens will be attached to the problem of its dark maximum aperture. And yes, even with the benefit of image stabilization, you will often be shooting at quite high ISO levels as a result of it. But if you can live with that, then a host of benefits will be your reward. Good build quality and a lightweight body, sharp image quality with lightning fast autofocus and low focus breathing, good contrast, and a spectacularly close minimum focus distance. If you also take into account the lens's reasonable price and flexible zoom range, then you can't really go wrong. It's a surprisingly accomplished lens really, and if you can look beyond its dark aperture, it does come highly recommended. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this review and found it helpful. If you'd like to support the channel, then take a look at my Patreon page down in the description below. It makes a big difference and supporters get all kinds of exclusive content that I really enjoy putting together. Ciao for now.